There's a question. Who's your favorite director and film?
Favorite film and director, I have a lot. Pedro Almodovar is a Spanish director. Has a lot of influence over my works. And there's one film that he made that I go back to over and over again called All About My Mother. So that is the film that I see new things every time I rewatched it, especially when I'm writing and I have writer's block. I would revisit the film. I like his approach towards melodrama. It's always with a lot of approach towards critiquing Spanish politics and also just society and womanhood in general. So he's someone that I would definitely go with a favorite director in film.
Another question. Will be continue your filmmaking journey? Will you do something else artistically or medium-wise? Or do you have any advice for artists or filmmakers in China?
I started out when I was in high school and junior college. Before going into film, I did theater and I did fine arts. I wouldn't even call it sort of like something I majored in. But I remember the first big piece of art I did when I was 17. It's an entrance exam to university. I was very much inspired by Chinese propaganda art as an artistic form, but also as messages. And I compare it with ads that we see in Singapore. I sort of for a while majored in painting. So it was a piece of art installation where it was talking about public housing in Singapore, but in the form of the influence coming from Chinese propaganda art. It was something I used to think about where I thought of going back to painting at some point. I think it is more a therapeutic way for me when I'm not writing or making films. I go back to painting when I can. I think in terms to the second question about advice about being an artist and filmmaker, I think at least for me, and I say this to my students as well, it's the joy and the privilege of being an artist or being a filmmaker is that you get to expose yourself to a lot of mediums and a lot of works. And I think that is part of your life that you have to continually do. And it's something I try to kind of do as much as I can, especially in this day and age where there's so much noise in terms of what you consume. I think it's sometimes good to put that away and really let your mind sort of rest a little bit and really take the time to be present, to consume and embrace whatever art or whatever medium that you are looking at. I think that's one of the things I'm not doing enough. I've been trying to go back into it is to read or even just listening to music or things I feel like practices artists needs to understand how to be able to turn off those noises, but also listen to it and be a part of those conversations.
Yeah, we have another question from Ray Chan. Thank you so much for sharing. Sorry for not being able to speak up at this moment, but I wonder if you could talk a bit more about translating and working with languages that you're not familiar with, that you've mentioned before, I think Korean and Spanish. How that affects your directing process and so on.
That's a good question because I think when it comes to directing in a language that you understand and you speak it, you understand the nuances and you can make specific changes directly to the actors or when you're editing because you have that knowledge. When it's a language that you don't speak, it becomes this act of trying to find a person that you completely trust to help you make those become that translator. In my case for Ajuma, I had a translator with me literally all the time. So she's Singaporean, but she lives and works in Korea as an actor. So she speaks Mandarin, several dialects, English, Singlish, and Korean. So she was like someone who could translate things and translate the nuances. Not a lot of translators can do that, but she can pick up certain things that truly helped me in that specific instance. Even further back, I think translation of scripts was really something that I have to work with someone to go through every single line to make the appropriate changes, to have the person be on the same page as me about what I'm trying to say, what I truly mean, before it goes to the next round, which is the actors. So then the actors have their way of sort of translating things to make it sound as real as they can. Then that is sort of further confirmed by my translator to go like, yeah, he's making it sound right. That makes sense. So at the end of the day, it's a lot about who you work with to make sure that they are translating it right for you. I think there's a power of persuasion to make sure that you have someone who will help you translate it properly for you.
And the other question also from Ray Chen is the other question will be more regarding your trace back to your memories. Do you tend to write journals or anything at the moment when things are happening, or do you prefer to let them settle down in your memory and revisit them when you're collectively creating something? What are the sorts of media that help you to go back to your memory?
I used to write them down because I have this fear of forgetting it. And I would quickly, if I remember a certain thing. There was a time in my early 20s where blogging was like a thing. So that became my journal. And film becomes a medium actually, because there were times when I look back at the films I've done and go and be sort of embarrassed by it. But then there is a part of me that goes like, I remember why I made this film. I used to keep things for memory's sake. I need something tactile to remind me of that moment or remind me of certain things. I also feel like there's a part of me that does selective memory where I think I remember it a certain way, but who knows? Maybe it didn't really happen that way. It's just I'm projecting it, but it's still memory. Then the question is whether, I don't know, what do you think?
And also, like, to construct a memory scape in a film, it doesn't have to be your own memory, right? It can also
It doesn't have to be. I think it's collective memory of the space that I was in. And I feel like sometimes I've created memories for audience who have told me like, oh, you brought me back to a certain time, which I may not truly understand, but for someone else, it was unintentionally or intentionally a trigger for what they remember.
Yeah, another question from Mona. What do you see the position of Singaporean film in the entire global film industry, and what is the advantage and challenge of the current Singaporean film?
Thank you for that question, because it's an important one. Singapore cinema is still very young, although we have a history that goes back to when we were part of Malaya. Like I said before, when Singapore was this burgeoning city and you have a Chinese businessman who has the money to want to create a studio, they have directors from India, but they will have talents, on-screen actors from Malaya to make films. So when we separated from Malaya, that also died. So the film that I was going to put up on the cafe is Cathay Chris' first Chinese language film called Lion City, 狮子城. And I recently rewatched it. It's a restoration from the Asian Film Archive. And I understood why Singapore Chinese films sometimes may not do as well, because when I watched it, I went like, it's not the kind of Chinese film you're used to seeing from that era. A big part of it is the accent, the performance, the accent.
But do you see your film as Singaporean Chinese film or just Singaporean film?
Ajuma, I think, is in the media, they call it Singapore Korean co-production. And it is. But I think a part of it is very specifically Singaporean Chinese. It's because she speaks in Singaporean Mandarin. But I think I was not used to it. I think the challenge that we have with Singapore cinema is that because we are very multicultural, so there is no sense of like, what is that language that the Singaporean have? It's not, because English is still English. It's just a colloquial way of English. Our Mandarin is also not the most, I think people can understand it, but it's just like, it just sounds a little different. And I think filmmakers in Singapore face a challenge of wanting to tell stories that too localized, and it becomes a bit not universal enough. Singapore is also really expensive. It's an expensive city to film. So filmmaking is not a cheap art form. I feel like sometimes the filmmakers hear the films they want to make, it's either too esoteric, it's too difficult to understand, or films are too mainstream and too localized that, like for example, Jack Neo, Liang Zhiqiang. So Liang Zhiqiang is an entertainer. I grew up watching him, and he's a comedian. He also makes films, and his films are 搞笑行动, and then 小孩不笨. He's now making the third one, 小孩不笨3. So people seem to know Singapore films as like, oh, Liang Zhiqiang's films. And then now you have Chen Zheyi. Chen Zheyi, I think his films have been largely successful because he doesn't concern himself too much with that language that I think sometimes I overly concern myself. For him, it is about the story. It's about the emotion. It's about the storytelling in its most pure, basic form.
I feel like his recent films leans more on the genre as Singaporean Chinese film. For example, West Season and his recent film with the Chinese team, right? Randong. I think that's.
Have you seen it?
No, I don't think it's
Okay.
publicly released there. Yeah,
Okay.
but I
Oh
think
yeah,
that's takes a lot of understanding the Chinese language and Chinese culture, you know.
For sure. So for him, I think he understands that perfectly well. I'm actually curious because he has obviously, as a Singaporean filmmaker, he has made two films that very Singapore Chinese.
Right.
But his last two films, he produced Ajuma the same time when he was making these two films. One is an American film set in Greece, and then Rentong, which is shot in China with a whole full Chinese team. So it will be interesting to see that conversation because I think his position as a Singaporean director making films now that are not Singaporean.
Yeah. But I think isn't that also an advantage of being a Singaporean artist or director? You can stand on both sides of the filmmaking art.
Yeah, we talked about, me and Anthony has talked about this before, and I think the challenge about Singapore cinema is that sometimes we want to make films about Singapore, but then also being here, you realize sometimes how small it is. So there's the desire to get out and make films outside of Singapore. I do think that's a challenge. And sometimes I think that's why sometimes Singaporean films might not travel as well. And I think another part with a much deeper conversation is censorship in Singapore. So I think that's a big part of it also, that we have learned to self-censor ourselves. Like going to the US as a Singaporean filmmaker is that my first impression and my first reflection was that I self-censor myself a lot when I first go into the US. It's like, oh, can I say this? Can I not say this? Because in Singapore, I don't want to get into trouble. But then in the US, I become more like, I want to say it because I think it's an important conversation to have. It's an important question to ask. So I do realize sometimes there's a culture that I was brought up in that sort of nurtured me into kind of like, you don't want to offend someone, so let's not ask it.
Yeah, but also I think, for example, in a Juma film, right, in a very subtle way, you also brought in the topic of LGBT. I think that's a new development in Singaporean film and society, of course.
Because we have funding from Singapore also. So I remember I did brought that up when I was trying to get the grant. I think it's humanizing an experience that's very real for a lot of people. But also I kind of codify it in a way that I think it's not about that. It's about this woman's journey. But there's always going to be that fixation on a particular plot that is LGBTQ. So we ultimately were rated NC-16 in Singapore.
Another question, how do you find the Korean team? Do you need some kind of permit to go shooting in Korea?
Yeah, we worked very closely with a Korean production. My co-producer is Korean. It was also very hard to find Korean crew that spoke both English and Korean. I think my impression of the Korean film industry is that they are so well oiled. Korean films and drama has been quite impressive. They don't need to work with anyone else because they are very strong on their own. I get a sense that they never really had to work with foreign crews that much. But we really worked really well together. I think at least the team I worked with really wanted to tell the story I wanted to tell, and they shared that vision with me. They gave me their perspective and they gave me advice. And I do respect that space that they are providing me. Permit-wise, because it's a co-production in Korea, we also have money from the Korean Film Council. That's why officially it's seen as that, because they really provided a lot of assistance to help us make the film. It was their way of trying to kind of like, okay, connect with the rest of the world to make films. So I remember when we shot that, there were a few foreign films, I mean non-Korean films that shot in Korea that year. So I think it was their way of trying to solidify themselves as this cultural soft power, I think, which is really interesting to observe as an outsider.
Also, another question from Ray Chen, was that sort of censorship applied to both the in-person screening and online platform?
With film, I think the censorship, like there's ratings. So at least I don't want my film to be re-edited. So I've always like, this is the cut. And then they'll give you the rating based on whatever. And then you can ask to appeal. So my film went through, internally, I've heard that they've gone through some rounds of review before it's given this rating. But online, it's a little, I think because of these streaming platforms, it's always by age. So I think you have to like key in certain code in order to watch certain things.
I was surprised, you know, there was another political film, also documentary about like early history of Singapore, so To Singapore with Love. Allegedly, it was banned, but when I was in Singapore, I still found it, you know, able to be streamed on YouTube. and a lot of other platforms as well. So
that film was a documentary film by a filmmaker called Tan Pin Pin. It was banned because it was a film about political exiles.
Yeah.
So it was obviously a very sensitive topic in a film for the censorship board. So when it was banned, you can buy the DVD, but you can't ship it to Singapore. You can ship it to Malaysia, you can ship it anywhere else. I can't ship it to Singapore. So it's always the challenge of censorship, I think, Singapore some films would face.